Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon to all our listeners from different parts of the world. Welcome to our third panel discussion for 2020 on the topic that we have put for everybody, which is tackling the climate emergency with climate finance. Before I start the proceeds, I am sharing with you sad news that our colleague who was supposed to be our fourth speaker, His Excellency Mr. Ali Jassim, the CEO of Ittihad ESCO, could not join us because his wife passed away 2 days ago. So he's sitting in mourning, and we all share with him his sadness, and we pay condolence for his the loss of his beloved wife. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us in our third panel discussion. This is the second one that we are doing it virtually, and I'm very delighted to welcome my distinguished speaker, Dr. Nasser Saidi, the President of the Clean Energy Business Council and President of Nasser Saidi and Associates, Ms. Fatma Al-Hammadi. She is the acting director of the Air Quality Department at Ministry of Climate Change. Ms. TJ Lightwala, Managing Director, Lead for Experience Services, MENA Accenture. Thank you very much for taking the time off your busy schedules and joining us this morning, which promises to be a very, very strong platform, and inshallah we will all benefit from the interesting and valuable input from all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. I would like to thank our sister organizations who usually rally around us to ensure that we roll out these programs effectively. The Arabia CSR Network, the Emirates Environmental Group, Clean Energy Business Council, and the Swiss Business Council. So thank you for this continued support. And this shows that as NGOs functioning on the ground in the UAE, it is very important that we put our efforts together and roll out effective platforms that can benefit all members of society, and we can gain valuable knowledge from these kind of interactions. Usually, before I start the day, I give a brief to all our members of what we have been doing during the previous months. So since we last met, it was on the 26th of May, we had our second panel discussion. So in the month of June and July, we have been very active in so many of the action program in spite of the lockdown, in spite of the restrictions that we have. But we really managed to be innovative in the way we deal with our audience. We had the first virtual awarding ceremony. We celebrated the Emirates Recycling Awards on the 8th of June under the patronage of His Excellency Engineer Sheikh Salim bin Sultan bin Saqr Al Qasimi, Chairman of Ras Al Khaimah Civil Aviation and member of the Executive Council of Ras Al Khaimah and honorary member of EEG. We managed to award 47 entities in the Emirates Recycling Awards in our 6 recycling programs, as well as we celebrated the winners of the environmental drawing competition, which is our student members, and there were a total of 30 winners. We reached out to all our corporate members, to all our supporters, and we managed to secure wonderful gifts that were given to all the entities that won. So it was really a very successful event in spite of it being only virtual event, very well attended by all our members, associates within the wide network of Emirates Environmental Group. We managed to conclude the first phase of our, again, action program, which is One Road, One Community Tree. This is a very popular community-based program that sees participants from the different sectors of society, whether they are corporations, academic institutions, or the families and community at large. And as a result of the first phase, the savings were more than almost 6,000 trees that have been saved as a result of this program, with very strong mitigation of CO2 emissions as well. Beginning of June, we rolled out a program for our student community, which is a neighborhood recycling program, and it will conclude on 30th of September. And it is this, again, this is a program that is very well received by our student community, and they love to join us and to be actively involved. It entails them to interact with their neighbors, preach the message, if you like, about recycling, and manage to collect some recyclable material. They achieve the target and they get to plant trees under their names, which will take place, inshallah, this year on 20/12/20. Another program that we rolled out was in June on the World Day to combat desertification was Recycle, Reforest, Repeat. And this is on paper collection. The program resulted in the participation of 144 corporations and the total collection of around 69,000 kgs of paper. The total number of trees that have been secured for this project will be 94 trees that these participants earned, and it will be planted on 2012/20. And of course, the CO2 mitigations and landfill space saved as a result of these programs are all added value to us. Throughout from the month of June and July, we have had a total of 26 engagements with the United Nations Environment Program. These are all virtual meetings, but it really took us into wide network about plastic littering in the oceans, about food security, about climate change, about climate finance, about environmental laws and regulations. These are all very strong platforms that requires us to give input and to be actively involved in engagements and to give our feedback, and the recognition has been nicely coming from the UN, in addition to other UN bodies that we have been actively involved in. So this, in summary, has been the platform that we have been engaging the community, trying to keep them actively involved during this period, and to keep them to sensitize them on environmental issues, to get them hands-on in environmental protection platforms. And the results have been encouraging for us to continue, I must say. So we come now to this today's program, which is tackling the climate emergency. And as I hope really that with the pandemic, this issue has not been sidetracked and has not gone down to the level of, of the agenda, that it is still at the top of the agenda, and we have to ensure that it is on the top of the agenda of the decision makers, of corporations, of everybody really. So we are tackling it from a new perspective, from the importance of climate finance is very, very crucial when you are talking about climate change. It really requires large-scale investment if we are to significantly reduce emissions, particularly in sections where there are heavy industries, where they are using fossil fuels, heavily energy-intensive sectors. These are all very important issues that needs to be put on the table and be tackled. The Paris Agreement, the Convention, and the Kyoto Protocol, they all called for financial assistance. And we need to have the financials from the more stable countries to those that are less developed and less stable and more vulnerable. And I believe you all have heard last year when the Secretary General of the United Nations rolled out the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. And he called on all the financial institutions from around the world to really put proper strategies and to have really disruptive change to ensure that we do have the finances to carry on the work that needs to be done to deal with the Agenda 2030. So countries have agreed to provide financial assistance to developing countries in implementing the objectives of the United Nations framework for combating climate change. Now we need to find how do we get the governments and the stakeholders to understand and assess what are those financial needs of the developing countries, and how can they be mobilized, and how can they be channeled towards that directions. Key investment can build a resilience to pandemics and climate change. As we are seeing now, the second stage of coronavirus ravaging its impact on 40 countries that have registered again a comeback of it, and the numbers are very worrying. So what really the world's energies are currently focused on, and we are all focused on fighting this virus, and to manage our resources, and to manage the to stop the economic devastations in many countries. But having said that, climate emergency is as urgent as that. And I hope, again, I will repeat that this is not forgotten and it is not sidetracked. We all need to be very, very much alert of that. And we have to see the connectivity between environment and health, environment and economic stability and economic sustainability, as many were before thinking that environment is a standalone issue. Today, this is completely proven wrong, and we all know that these are all very intertwined and very interconnected issues. In addition, climate change related shocks in developing countries is also overlapping with the COVID-19 crisis, and it is further disrupting efforts to contain the virus. So it's stretching really the resources, the limited resources that are within these entities, to ensure that they are able to deal with it in an effective manner. But when you look in the aftermath of any disaster, whether it is climate-related crisis, whether it is a pandemic, the key to a successful and speed recovery is the financial ability, financial liquidity. In 2009, developed countries agreed to contribute $100 billion in climate finance by 2020 to help poorer nations reduce their emissions and adapt to climate impacts. Well, we are in 2020. How far have we managed to deliver on this promise? We only have 5 months left, actually. The Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, said, and I would like to read his quote, we have a strategic responsibility now to recover better. We must take this opportunity to respond to the pandemic and the climate emergency in unison without ignoring one over the other. So large financial institutions, including the World Bank, have since advocated for climate finance and other forms of green stimulus as part of the COVID-19 recovery plans. And this is a very welcoming step, and we hope all other financial institutions will follow suit, and this will be a way forward. Special attention on the road to recovery towards a post-pandemic should be given to developing countries, where, as I mentioned, the impact of coronavirus is said to be most severe, because they do not have the means, they do not have the capital to transition it and to deal with it in a shorter. So the death rates have been much higher, and their economic downturn has been very, very badly obvious. I would like to focus today on the role of the private sector and the role that it has to play in the response to the climate emergency and to COVID-19. Nobody denies that the private sector is the biggest consumer of energy and produces hardly emissions, harmful emissions, sorry. So by having the right finances injected by the private sector to ensure that we are dealing with this issue, it will definitely help countries meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement. Because climate change presents huge financial risks to the global economy as a whole. We hope through this platform, through today, discussion that we will be able to discuss particularly goal number 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impact from different perspectives. And that's why the speakers that we have invited today are from diverse sectors. Each one of them will enrich us from their own perspective to bring some meaning to this title and share with us tips on practical ways that everyone can contribute to deal with this scenario. It gives me great honor and great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nasser Saidi, a very dear friend and a very strong and sound supporter of Emirates Environmental Group and the other sister organization, the Arabia CSR Network. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Nasser is the chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council, and he is the president of Nasser Saidi and Associates, and he's an honorary member of Emirates Environmental Group. Dr. Nasser, the floor is yours, please.
Good morning, Habiba, and as usual, my congratulations for everything you and EEG have been doing. It's extraordinary, and it gives hope. And the reason fundamentally is that you're working at grassroots level, and many of us, of course, are involved at a high level. We talk about principles, we are involved with various organizations. But the bottom line always is people, people in their households, people in their work, people in factories and businesses, and you reach out to them. So I think that is extraordinary. So I salute you and the efforts you put in. When you mention how many trees you saved, obviously it is not in millions, but in our part of the world, every tree is worth maybe 10,000 somewhere else. So, well done.
Thank you very much.
Let me perhaps start by saying a little bit about what the current challenges are that we're facing, and particularly in our part of the world. Because before we start talking about various instruments, how do we finance climate change, how do we mitigate the risks, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we are now living an unprecedented crisis, particularly in our part of the world. If you look at the MENA region and the oil producers, there are two major shocks. There's COVID and a global recession on the one side.
Dr. Saidi, are you still there? Ms. Habiba, I think Dr. Saidi got disconnected.
We have lost Dr. Nasser, I believe.
Yes, so I think he has some internet issues. So I think he will try to reconnect. So maybe we can proceed to the next presenter while Dr. Saidi is connecting.
Oh, okay. And then he will speak after the second speaker?
I think so, yeah. I'll try to solve the internet issue with him offline.
Okay. So it gives me, sorry, our listeners and our audience, really participants for this tech glitch, we will deal with it shortly. But in the meantime, I would like to welcome Ms. Fatma Al-Hammadi from the Ministry of Climate Change. Ms. Fatma, can you please start your presentation? I'm sorry we lost Dr. Nasser there, but inshallah he will continue after you have finished your presentation. The floor is yours, Ms. Fatma. Hello, Sahlan.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. In the beginning, I would like to thank Emirates Environmental Group for the invitation and the opportunity to contribute in this panel. And I would really like to congratulate EEG for all of these successful projects that have been going on since years. And thank you again. This morning, I would like to present to you what happened during the COVID outbreak and what changes have been gone with the air pollution across the UAE during this outbreak. Next slide, please. Yeah. In this outbreak, we noticed that there was a major reduction in ambient concentration around the world in nitrogen dioxide. We have carried on an air emission inventory earlier, and we know that nitrogen dioxide main sources in UAE are transport, followed by power generation and oil and gas activities. During that phase, we analyzed the monthly average concentration of nitrogen dioxide from January to June 2020, given the fact that it was the most affected pollutant by the restriction imposed during COVID on transport and traffic. Next slide. Yeah. We have also captured multiple satellite data that was produced by Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center that shows clearly that there was a reduction going on during the phase of the sterilization period in UAE, and the second week exactly of March, we noticed that reduction. And at that time, the prominent wind direction was the northwestern direction, and the most or the biggest source are the roads and the generation, and those are located specifically in our coastal area. So at that time, the wind was blowing toward the inland. Next slide, please. We have conducted a study within 26 stations across the countries where we selected to assess the changes in the ambient concentration pollutants measured between, as I told you, January to June 2020. The station was located in different areas, and it covered like traffic stations, background stations, and we also included industrial and residential to see what is the behavior or what is the behavior of that pollutant at that time, and what changes have been going on in all of those stations. Next slide, please. As you can see, there was a major reduction in NOx pollutant during the outbreak, and you can see clearly from the graphs that till June we reached almost to 23 microgram per cubic meter, and the reduction was almost 45% compared to February 2020. During the last week of March, as I said, the daily average have shown a great reduction trend in NOx averages. The highest reduction noticed at that time was in the station located proximity of busy roads and residential sites. For example, and it was a clear example, Musafah Street Station, there was a reduction of 77% from the average concentration reported in February 2020. Next slide. Here you can see the differences between our average concentration in the country per month between 2019 and 2020, and you can see a clear reduction in the same period of time through the breakout of the COVID-19 and previously in the year 2019 as well. Next slide, please. So, in summary, or to summarize all this, we have done a study to compare the period of February to June 2020 to determine the reduction rate in concentration of nitrogen dioxide. The major reduction trend were observed in the cities and settlements that implemented strong policies that influences transport movement. As I said, NOx comes directly from transport sector and from power generation sector. Overall, an average of 45% reduction in NOx concentration were observed in between that period, and a reduction of monthly average of NOx concentration were observed compared to the same period of 2019 as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions, please feel free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatma, for that beautiful presentation and for sharing with us the results. That we will leave the questions till the end. We will go ahead with all the presentations, and then there will be direct questions from myself, and there will be questions by the attendees through chat that they will be sharing with us, and we can read it to you, and you can answer for the rest of the speakers as well. I don't know if we have Dr. Nasser Beck. Ahmed, can we?
Not yet. He's still trying to connect. It's an internet issue. So. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ms. TJ Lightwala. She's the Managing Director Lead for Experience Services, MENA, in Accenture MET. Ms. Lightwala, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Habiba. It's a pleasure to be here, and obviously a really interesting and great forum to contribute towards sustainability and environmental change in our region. So it's a fantastic opportunity. Thank you for having us. So I will present Accenture's point of view. I lead the digital transformation services for Accenture, and I'm an enthusiast for sustainability and environmental protection. And so what I'd like to do today is take you through a point of view on what it means from an Accenture lens, and also a few stats on how we are driving change towards the betterment of the environment, the sustainability charter for our region, as well as from a global standpoint. So if you can move the slide along, that'll be great. If you can move to the next slide, please. Great. So this is Lawrence Morvan. She is our Corporate Social Responsibility Officer in North America, and also a part of our Global Management Committee. And she's really passionate about the fact that as a CSR lead, she's always quoting about how our business, has to serve the clients, the people in the society with purpose, innovation, but also a commitment towards responsible innovation that's a benefit to all of us. So economically, socially, environmentally, towards the benefit of all people and society. And this is really fundamental, not only for our CSR mandate, but also for the way that actually our corporation, Accenture, believes in the way we work for our clients and our vendors and suppliers to drive economic change, but in a sustainable and a transformative way that is energy efficient, environmentally protection, and for the future generations to enjoy. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is a really interesting slide because it really showcases how Accenture is expanding its charter and roadmap for environmental ambition. Our strategy is really broken down into 3 dimensions. The first dimension is how do we drive our low carbon economy with our clients and suppliers. So it is our fundamental duty to not only look at the environment from the lens of our own production, but also partner with corporations and vendors and show our clients the way forward on how sustainable economic value can be created by using energy efficient mechanisms. A second is looking at our own carbon emissions and other impacts such as waste generation and water use and other parts of the circular economy to ensure that we are ahead of what we believe is, carbon neutral, energy efficient, looking at carbon offsetting in ways in other countries, looking at agriculture technologies, even looking at impact investments such as funds that protect startups that actually invest in technologies that are sustainable in nature. And then lastly, work with officials and governments as well as the private sector to institute that change across the board. So our product base in this roadmap is built into the 6 circles that are mentioned here. One is the carbon strategy and portfolio management, where we assess the carbon offsetting plans and the carbon production plans through analytics that are captured in one area but are offset in the supply and demand of another area. So it's a supply demand equation using interesting analytics that are generated for countries that are high carbon producing versus countries that are low carbon producing, such that where there's high carbon producing countries, we are able to offset it with afforestation initiatives. Looking at renewable energy as an interesting source of CapEx assessment and understanding how companies can actually motivate beyond just short-term gains and look at renewable energies for their future operating costs. We, like I mentioned, on the procurement side of the business, we want to engage in transparent supplier relationships that are working on energy efficient technology mechanisms and ways of supplying goods and services to us that are compliant with our ambition to become environmentally conscious. And we have certain stats that I will share with you in the upcoming slides. From a workplace perspective, I think this is the most interesting dimension of what we have faced after COVID, which is quite interesting in terms of just the dynamic of health and balance and the ability of us not to be able to meet people or travel to other places. It has automatically generated reduction in the carbon footprint. We're not in the cars, we're not traveling anymore, or haven't traveled since March. And especially business travel is scrutinized, and because of that, our carbon footprint has tremendously decreased, not only in the region but even globally. And we have also implemented a very interesting analytics system that actually tracks our carbon footprint when we do business travel. So the corporation and firm helps us offset the metric tons of carbon waste emitted by our air travel or car travel or train travel in other parts of the world that are required to have afforestation initiatives. Green IT assessment is something that we do for our clients in terms of assessing their needs to become more green. And according to the Green Pact that Europe and North America have launched, and even Habiba spoke about several different interesting initiatives that are translating towards how we can become more greener, and more greener can happen at an individual level, to a community level, to a corporation or private sector level, all the way to a government sector. And innovation is a key part and a part of my passion. Like I said, investments in social impact investments in terms of conscious collective investments are quite interesting. And there are lots of companies that are driven towards financial inclusion, climate change, and also agricultural technologies that are helping us determine how we can be more environmentally conscious and more sustainable. And in fact, just today there was a release on at Accenture on how we are able to also have a point of view on reducing plastic waste in oceans. So all of this is determining towards our better environmental ambition. Next slide, please. So our strategy is threefold. Our reduction in scale of emissions is reduce our own emission. We have a mandate, and I'll state a few stats over here, to go 100% renewable by 2023. We committed in 2019 to procuring 100% renewable energy across all our global facilities. And so we have joined the Renewable Energy Pact through a global leadership initiatives. That's interesting from a utility point of view, because we're not using as much energy due to the benchmarks that have been set forward by our company. Second, how do we have suppliers through our assessments that I've mentioned to be more profiled on the green supplier list rather than the red supplier list. And we work with those that are mandated on the green supplier list, which is quite interesting because we are making a very deliberate effort to be environmentally conscious from our facility point of view, but also from a supplier point of view who help us work on our client businesses. And lastly, clients are especially, after COVID, and they're thinking about how energy conscious they need to be. I mean, climate change was huge. Greta Thunberg was the person of the year, and it wasn't a Hollywood star, or it wasn't a president. It was an advocate for the environment and climate change. So that just puts into perspective the gravity of the situation and the seriousness of the situation, both at the government level and a private sector level. And clients are playing their own part on how they are taking small steps to get environmentally conscious. And the small steps could be as small as not having plastic cutlery in the offices, having biodegradables, making sure the lights are switched off, or having energy efficient lighting in the office such that it's activated by motion sensors. And these kinds of small initiatives are driving further contribution to become more efficient. Next slide, please. So we are roughly working with 200 global companies that have made a commitment to go 100% renewable, and renewable meaning that they have taken several different steps to get there. It's an initiative that has a broad timeline, obviously, because it takes time to transition from technologies, from a people perspective, from a facilities perspective, etc. And so I believe that this is really inspiring, but also it puts a lot of pressure on suppliers, the corporation to do right by the environment, and also to hold us accountable to our clients. So I don't think any one of us want to work with people who are generally environmentally irresponsible, just because we've had a higher degree of understanding on the impact of what it is to be irresponsible towards the environment. So, I think that this is quite phenomenal. This is just a landscape of so many different companies globally that we're working with. And, also we are working on PPAs. PPAs is a part of our global corporate clean energy purchases. And I'm sure some of you who are in this space are quite aware of it. It's a power purchase agreement, which is a legal contract between an electricity generator, a seller, and a power purchaser, in which the renewable energy component of the deal is structured to a benchmark, which is, I won't get into a lot of technicalities, but it's a benchmark that has to be supplied in a PPA such that we are able to be more energy efficient. Climate change is really important as well. I mean, you know, I'm again going to state another fact, which is quite interesting from a statistical point of view. It says corporations release 31 gigatons. I mean, gigatons is already out of my understanding of what it is, of greenhouse gases globally each year, equivalent to emissions from more than 8,000 coal power plants, which is just infuriating, if you ask me. So, you know, in that regard, private sector engagement in climate change mitigations would make a significant difference in emissions while protecting our assets. So this is a risk if we are not taking the right actions and we're not helping. Again, step changes are important, and like Habiba was stating, every project, she said she's had 21 initiatives. Every project that we do, everything that we are incorporating our, you know, responsible business initiatives, if we can ask more of our clients, our partners and suppliers to be on board with what is going to impact our environment is essentially crucial. We want it to be a safe place for us to reside as humans for the next, for infinitum. Next slide, please. So this is our Clean Energy Act. Accenture is committed to, you know, the RE initiative, which is renewable 100% by 2023. Bring together the right business partners to do it. We've joined the Climate Change Committee and Corporation in New York we've put our stake in the ground on a global level to do that. We are working with the audit groups that survey and benchmark our growth or our improvements and our contributions towards climate change. We do that annually as a part of our mission to get to 100% by 2023. We've clearly stated this as our part of our global investor mandate. So it is quite serious. Also, Accenture is committing to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions as a part of this wider commitment towards RE 100. You know, this is in our books. It's defined as the environmental responsibility policy. We've also released a plastics playbook recently. We are committing to our carbon reduction strategy as well, as we've mentioned before. We have a severe focus on travel management through the purchase of verifiable renewable energy that is compliant. You know, I just say that since we've started tracking this more systematically into our vision, our environmental journey began as early as 2007. We have saved roughly 1.94 million megawatts hours of electricity. I'm stating facts here, more than 1 million metric tons of carbon emissions, and generated more than 258 million $258 million in energy savings. So this, again, if you look at it over a long time horizon, there is not only a cost improvement, but there is also a reduction in, you know, in the environmental impact. We've taken a cloud-first approach in the way we operate and communicate at work across our global network, and therefore we are 100% energy efficient in our operations, because even as we deprecate some of our laptops, they're never really wasted. We recycle them or have it donated, so it's a part of the circular economic cycle where nothing ever goes to waste, and therefore reducing the environmental e-waste, as it's called, electronic waste, into the ecosystem. Next slide, I'll take you through the thinking of how a procurement process works. Our procurement process is obviously quite deep and long, as you would expect a consulting firm to have, but although that also gives you a lot of, you know, a lot of understanding in terms of the depth of the process that we follow in ensuring that we have a trifecta of our supplier, our client, and our contribution towards the greater good. So our procurement also is driven towards the same mandate of RE100 by 2023. We have 4 main boxes in which we look at in which we look at the office leasing space and how we can make it energy compliant. We don't own office space, so we're typically looking at ways to reduce our contribution to electricity, water usage, biodegradables, recyclables, initiatives that my colleague also is online. Begona, she leads our responsible business initiative across the region, and she's very active. Similarly, we've put several different initiatives across the region between UAE and Saudi Arabia in place to ensure that we're driving that demand. I mentioned about the electricity tender status that we have. We have a pretty thorough process on electricity consumption and usage, compliancy towards the auditing committee for climate change. And then when we look at planning, whether it be corporate leasing, we speak directly to the landlords. I mean, sometimes the landlords are a little behind times, the buildings are behind times, and they're not energy efficient enabled. In this case, the discussion is a bit longer, and then there are always options of how we can get to a place that is energy efficient. That's a part of our options. We obviously always have discussions with our landlords on the influence type of the electricity supplied, positive influence, renewable energy, solar panels, recyclable energy and electricity, and how we can use that. And then execution of those contracts are a part of our procurement process, where we have them all enlisted as a part of our business intermediaries, and they have been listed against a heavy set of rules that make them green or that don't make them viable for Accenture. And there's always an internal assessment and a vetting process that makes sure that we are actually proceeding with the right partnerships and technology assessments that are required for it to check box the criteria for sustainable and ESG. Finally, a little bit more lighthearted is, if you can roll to the next slide, is some of our thought leadership. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is, if you ever want to have, interesting reading with great graphs and charts, and what the economists say, and what each of our subject matter experts say. We have a thorough thought leadership that is publicly available, and we've in fact have a few articles and POVs on sustainability after COVID. We have some interesting trends in digital transformation, which is the business that I lead. That is such a huge business that has gone into effect as a result of COVID-19. And we are talking about sustainability and digital transformation playing hand in hand towards driving change. So I would highly recommend taking a look at Fjord Trends, driving value during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. How do we survive the next wave, and what are the things that we can do to be ahead of the curve, at least from a knowledge perspective, and also from an investment perspective into the right technologies, processes, people, and skills to drive the next wave forward for our businesses. So with that, I'll close. I hope this has been informative, but I leave the floor back to Habiba. Thank you, Habiba.
Fatma, TJ, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, beautiful food for thought. There's a lot of giveaways that you have given us, takeaways from this presentation for everyone to really look at how can we take that and implement it in our own organization. You have very solid results that you shared with us. Thank you very much for that. I believe, thank you. I believe we have Dr. Nasser back with us. Dr. Nasser, are you with us? Can you please join?
I'm back with you. I'm back with you. I hope you can see and hear me now.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Nasser.
I'm in London. I'm supposed to have good broadband, but as you can see, they cut me off.
Go ahead.
So let me try to recap from where we are. I really wanted to start it off from what we are living right now in terms of an unprecedented crisis at a global level, the COVID crisis and the economic crisis that comes with that. and particularly in our region, because we're facing two major shocks. We're facing COVID and the global recession, which has meant a decline in the demand for our goods, our services, our oil, our tourism, and all our trade. And at the same time, we're facing lockdown. So we've had the supply shock, which turned into a demand shock. But in addition to that, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we have this very large oil shock, which affects, of course, government revenues. Many of the governments in the oil-producing countries are highly dependent on oil for their revenue. Something like 80% of their revenue comes from that. And that has meant that many of them are now cutting down spending. And if you look at the overall economic impact, it is quite severe. The IMF is forecasting a decline in real income across the region by about 5.76%. For the Gulf countries, even more, probably around 7 to 8%. Now, the reason why we should think about that is that it prevents the governments from being able to undertake climate risk mitigation measures. When you don't have the fiscal space, it means you cannot address many of the climate risks that we're talking about and anti-pollution measures and the like. So we have to keep that in mind, particularly for the more vulnerable countries across the region. And remember that many of the countries are facing continuing turmoil, all the way from Iraq to Syria, to Yemen, to Libya, to Sudan. And that means the focus of those governments are not at all on the issues that we are concerned with today. They're focused on survival. They're focused on how to deal with the COVID pandemic. And they are extremely vulnerable because they don't have the public health systems. So this is just a word of warning, simply to say that as we move forward and as we get into our discussion about climate finance, we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are large disparities across the countries of the region, how they can deal with climate risk and how they can bring resources to bear for climate finance. So let me get in now into directly into our topic, and I'll try to make up for the lost time. There are three levels at which we need to work when we're talking about climate finance. First, we need to work at the level of households and businesses. Why households and businesses? Because they are the main users of energy, and they are at the forefront in terms of dealing with climate. So, and when we turn to households and businesses, we need to think of several dimensions. First, power usage, and trying to create incentives both for households and businesses to move away from high carbon use producing energy, more towards renewables. Second is in terms of heating and air conditioning, particularly air conditioning in our region. How do we reduce the use of energy, and particular fossil fuel energy for those uses? And here, obviously, we need to work with the utilities companies, whether they are government utilities companies or private sector utilities companies, in providing incentives to households and businesses in terms of their power use across the whole set of activities. We are really at the beginning of this in many of the countries in our region. So one major program that we need to work on is to work with utilities companies, electricity, water, waste management across the region, in terms of asking what incentives are you giving to households and businesses to address climate risk, and how are you helping them finance it? That means, how are you helping them, for example, set up solar panels? How are you helping them to reduce water and energy use? Some of the utilities in our region have started doing that. I see that happening, for example, in Diwa and Advia in the UAE and a couple of other countries. We need to encourage much more than that. Second part is, of course, transport. That is a major area, and that means when we think about transport, that tends to use about 15 to 20% of energy. Here, we need to think of what sort of incentives should be given for e-mobility, for using electric cars and electric transport throughout. Here again, we're at the beginning of a long road. So here, what needs to happen is working with governments so that tariffs, taxes, and fees are imposed on high pollution cars and provide more incentives for e-mobility. And COVID, I think, is helping us in this because the whole movement of work from home means that we're probably going to spend less on transport and therefore the energy required for transport. And at the same time, it will give us an incentive towards moving towards e-mobility. That needs to be worked in tandem between governments and the transport sector. Third area has to do with energy efficiency. Here, there are a number of programs across the region, but again, this is where the private sector and the public sector need to come together to reduce energy, to increase energy efficiency across the region. We are not energy efficient. On average, we use two times as much energy as the average OECD country in producing output. So we well know that energy efficiency is a low-hanging fruit. So we need a strong focus on that in terms of reducing, addressing climate risks. The final area, I think, when we're thinking about households and businesses, is digitalization, industrial digitalization. And this goes all the way from digitalizing the energy sector itself, having more intelligent energy production, power grids, and the like, to greater digitalization of all our activities. The reason why this is so interesting is that for many of the GCC countries, for Middle East region countries, this provides you with a big incentive to go into the knowledge economy, towards digital economy, and helping transform our economies and diversifying away from oil and gas. So COVID as well gives us a big incentive to start shifting our economy towards away from oil and gas. And therefore, this digital transformation of all our activities is an important way to address climate risk and also to help us invest in that. Now let's turn, so that's in terms of households and businesses, but let's turn next to the role of governments, because that is the second major way that we can start addressing climate risks. The climate, of course, governments are major providers of public utilities, and of course they need financing. And here I think what needs to happen is that we need to encourage our governments to start working on green finance, on issuing green sukuk, green bonds, and other types of financial instruments to finance infrastructure. So two levels here. One is look at intelligent, energy efficient infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, because they're still in the large business of doing that, and finance it through these climate friendly instruments, green bonds, green sukuk, and help grow that sector. We also need to do that with our various financial centers. We have a number of major financial centers across the region. Two of them happen to be in the UAE, the Dubai International Financial Center and AGGM, the Abu Dhabi Global Market. Both of them have started sustainability finance programs. Governments need to work with them as well as with their banks and financial institutions to focus much more on climate finance, on having platforms which are helpful for the issuance of bonds, sukuk, and other types of instruments. Here, the idea is that our financial centers should become international financial centers for renewable energy, for climate finance, investment, and risk mitigation activities. So we should open it up for companies that are working in the clean energy and clean technology sectors, governments that want finance for facing climate-related issues. So open up those markets to governments and businesses. Our financial centers need to be strongly focused on that. The third area is the banking and financial system. So we've got households and businesses, we've got governments and financial centers, but then there's a primary and major role for banks and financial institutions. Why is that? That's because they dominate the financial landscape. More than 80% of the financing in our region comes from banks. And therefore, what needs to happen is that our banks need to be thinking about climate finance and how they provide climate finance across the whole supply chain. That is not easy to do, but they're going to be helped by central banks and supervisors. Central banks across the world have now come to realize that climate risk is going to be the major risk facing economies and therefore the banking and financial system. So financial system and banking system stability is going to be increasingly challenged by climate-related risks. Now, we now have a network of supervisors for greening the financial system, so NGFS. Now, this is mainly in developed economies. Our financial centers, AGGM, DIFC, and others have started discussing with those. But what needs to happen is for our central banks to start issuing guidelines, regulations, to encourage banks to provide climate-related finance and to provide disincentives for investing in fossil fuel industry. Now, this is a major challenge because in our region, that's much of our activity. So how do we achieve this transformation of moving away gradually from financing fossil fuel activities towards financing renewable, clean technology and other? This is the big transformation that needs to happen in our region. And it has to happen at the level of our banks and financial institutions. And it means the central banks have got to play a major role in doing so. So for us in civil society, for us as NGOs and other types of organizations, we need to be involved at the three levels that I mentioned, with households and businesses and the services and energy that they get and power that they use, transport systems. Second, we need to be working with governments in terms of what incentives they're giving for things like e-mobility, and how do they involve the private sector. And third, we need to be working with our banks and financial institutions and with our central banks. So those are three areas I think we need to be thinking of for the future. Now, let me just say a few words about the Clean Energy Business Council, which I have the honor of chairing. It is a membership organization. All our members, some 70 plus members, are deeply involved in clean energy and clean technology. They go all the way from energy companies in various types of energy, to management consultants, to lawyers, to individuals, across the whole board, really, in terms of everything related to clean energy and clean technology. This membership organization has been around now close to 7-8 years. We're very active across the region. And as we reach out We're working with both the private sector as well as government to be more forceful in our action. We've set up 4 working groups. One working group is for energy efficiency and encouraging energy efficiency across all types of systems that use energy. A second working group is on e-mobility and looking at ways and means of encouraging e-mobility across our region. The third one is climate finance. We have a climate finance working group working with banks, financial institutions, as well as lawyers, consultants, international organizations, the World Bank, UNDP, and others, looking at ways in which climate finance can be used to encourage this energy transition. And the final one is a working group on women in clean energy, in trying to encourage more women to join the fight for clean energy finance. So CBC really is a platform for companies, individuals, organizations, institutions to come together to achieve really the goal we all want, fundamentally to save our planet and to fight climate change. So let me just end there in terms of where I think we should be focusing our efforts in the years and decades to come. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser, for those wonderful words of wisdom and for putting it so succinctly in front of all of us, the direction forward. Thank you very much. So I will open the floor now for the questions, and we have the 3 speakers with us. And if anyone has questions as well, you can put them in the chat. We will see them and we will accordingly put it across to the speakers. Dr. Nasser, I would like to start with you, if you don't mind. So my question is, when countries and economies are threatened by war, by diseases, by natural disasters, etc., what does that mean for the sustainability and success of investing in sustainable development?
I think that is a major challenge. And that's why I raised the point at the beginning that there are big disparities across the countries in our region. Many of them simply don't have the resources even to survive, let alone make investments in clean energy and clean technology. What do we need to do? I think there are 2 levels. One, at a very high level, and this is already happening, is to provide debt relief. Already there's been a movement by the G20, by the IMF and the World Bank to provide debt relief to some 70 of the poorest countries in the world. What does the debt relief do? It simply means don't service your debt over the next few years. Use those resources to fight COVID, essentially. The IMF also has a rapid financing initiative, an RFI, whereby countries which need resources to fight COVID can come to the IMF and get financing. And a number of countries in our region have benefited from that already. Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and others are all looking to this type of financing. So one part is really debt relief, and the other part is to get financing to fight COVID. But that does not address climate-related issues. To do that, you have to go much further. And I think there are 2 things that we really need to do. One is that the richer countries in our region, and that means the Gulf countries, and in particular, I think the UAE and Saudi, have resources. And they are at the forefront in terms of clean energy and clean technology. They've been investing heavily in things like solar power, and increasingly now into wind and even geothermal. They need to make climate change, fighting climate change as part of foreign aid. So one of the major changes moving forward is to say we are already very generous in providing aid, and they are. If you look at the UAE, it provides at least as much foreign aid as a percentage of GDP as many of the most generous countries in the world, Northern Europe, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and others. What we need to say is orient more and more of that aid towards climate risk mitigation. That means providing technology, helping those countries establish solar power systems, and think of the enormous benefits. In many of the countries, just think of our region, think of Sudan, think of many of our region, many people are still living in rural areas. They don't even have access to power, to energy. If they don't have access to power, energy, they can't even enter the digital economy. When we think about work from home, that is an illusion for many countries, for many people in our countries. They don't even have access to the internet. So thinking of trying to work from home is a purely imaginary thing if they don't have power. So to come back to it, I think we need to provide climate risk mitigation as part of foreign aid policy. This would also help the countries of our region who are at the forefront. If you look at many of our power utilities, they are at the forefront in terms of solar power. So they can provide it directly themselves. They can help set up power plants. And what I would suggest then is also using our financial system. So we have export promotion agencies. Let them provide export promotion credit for our solar power, our utilities companies, to provide intelligent infrastructure that is energy efficient, climate resilient infrastructure in those poorer countries. So I think those would be two major ways that we would be helping those countries in the transition, both in terms of reducing their use of fossil fuel energy, but more important is investing into climate resistant infrastructure. So make it part of foreign aid, encourage our companies to invest in those countries which need it, and the companies themselves would benefit because they're exporting technology, they're exporting their know-how. And the final point, I think, is that, again, for our richer countries, we need to open up our universities and technology institutes to young people from those countries to spread the knowledge. It is one thing to provide technology. It is one thing to provide infrastructure. It is another thing to have it embedded. To have it embedded, you need people to have it embedded. You need people to be aware, and you need to transmit the knowledge and build capacity in those countries. So I think those are three ways I think we need to be moving. So work along with international organizations, help with debt relief and all the other good things that the United Nations, IMF, World Bank, G20 are doing, great. But at our level, I think in the region, let us help ourselves in the three ways I mentioned, in terms of putting it as part of foreign aid, getting our companies and providing them with incentives to invest in those poorer countries in terms of clean energy, clean technology, resilient infrastructure, and third, helping with education and greater awareness.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. Thank you very much. Fatima? Fatima, do you have it? Okay. My question to you, Fatima, will be how willing are the different sectors of the society, in your opinion, in the UAE, in the GCC region, with coming on board with the Green Agenda program for 2030? Do you believe there's a widespread awareness already, or is it something that is on the agenda for us, for example, in the UAE? Can you share that with us, please? You don't have the mic on, Fatma.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, one of the key policy area in stimulating the development of the new green businesses in the economy, and the economies like UAE experience an accelerate pace of urbanization and industrialization. In the UAE, a wide range of greenering efforts from both public and private sector are already growing in many areas, such as renewable energy, resource efficiency, waste reduction, green buildings, and sustainable transportation. Like during 2018-2019, we have made a lot of progress in implementing the Green Agenda 2030 and the Climate Change Plan 2050. More like UAE remains committed to the global and regional ambitions of resilient and sustainable future through participation in international multilateral negotiation. The UAE is also engaged in various dialogues and engagements to catalyze cooperation in the area of data and knowledge sharing, capacity development, and building green alliances as well. Also, UAE served as a global stage for several high-level global gathering support in sustainability as well.
Thank you very much, Fatma. TJ, do we have you on board?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to find out what kind of a role can players outside the financial industry play when it comes to climate finance and investment in sustainable technologies.
Yeah, so I wanted to quote, yeah,
You know?
you can hear me. So I wanted to quote two different things that New York has done and Europe has done on a government level, right? So New York announced the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act to combine both economic recovery as well as energy transition. Similar to what the doctor was saying on how the economic transformation of a country can really depend somehow on certain assets, on how we can use large-scale energy and clean energy projects towards the larger economic benefits. So that's number one. From a government point of view as an example. And number two, Europe recently, actually in January this year, the parliament voted on the Green Deal. I mean, it was covered in the news a lot. And a part of that was energy transition, together with digital transformation, how we can work hand in hand to ensure that there is enough of a stimulus package that's going towards the growth of the earth. Are you guys able to hear me? Because I'm hearing some feedback.
There's a bit of an echo there.
Yeah. So that's on a government level, two key examples. Secondly, I do think that we've got to drive innovation. Governments need to have some sort of an incentive to drive innovation. Now, from where I come from in the United States, there is a lot of, like, for example, you have tax credits or bonus discounts on if you have solar panels on top of your roof of your houses. If you are taking, carpooling to work, you can take the fastest lane forward, and that fastest lane forward doesn't have any toll or SALIC on it. If you buy a hybrid car, you have a tax deduction on the amount that you paid for the car, or you get a better loan rate on your car loan. So there are certain incentives that are kicking in both from a government perspective and a private sector perspective to drive personal change, but personal change inevitably transforms business change. So I'm a big believer of that, you know, I believe that even in the region that we live in, there will be a transformation towards that kind of energy efficiencies, such as the utilization of mobility and the Hyperloop that's coming in the UAE that will have better pricing once you start using it. So the government is instituting small change. If we actually see it holistically, we will notice patterns on how they're doing it. But it's just that, do we notice it enough is question number one. And question number two is, are we consciously thinking about it from a day-to-day perspective? So that's my take on it. I think there is a definitely quantified value of transformation that governments can you know, instill on corporations. For example, for our firm Accenture, we have a value that we're placing on renewables, and I believe that if that is met with the help of the government and the public sector, that's even a good that's already a transformation of sorts.
Habiba, can I jump in at this stage?
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Because this is important. If you look at the United States, Europe, and others, they have the fiscal tools, right? They have taxation systems which are well developed, where you can provide all sorts of incentives, tax and related incentives. We don't have that. We don't have that in our countries of the region. Our fiscal systems, our tax systems are underdeveloped. We don't even have social safety net. In many countries, we don't even have unemployment insurance to help countries deal with COVID. So one of the things that we need to do, and this is something we're trying to do through the CBC and its activities, is to work on policy responses, to help our countries and our governments develop the sorts of tools that we need to create the right incentives for energy efficiency, for investment, for anti-climate change, all that. We need to do that. We haven't been doing anything close to what is required. So I think one of the areas in which we need to work is not only on public-private cooperation, but simply in terms of equipping our governments with the sorts of tools that are required to effect an energy transition. We're right at the beginning of the work in this activity. So let's give that a big plus. And that is why, for example,
this is a very, very important point that you are touching. Really, it's a sore point actually. Yes, it's a fact that in many governments of the region, it does not have the technical capacity. It does not have the right expertise on board to carry out what needs to be done. So literally, whose responsibility is it to support the government? How do we go about it? Is it the academia that has to bring there? Is it international bodies? Is it the private sector? Whom do you think, Doctor, should be playing that role of building the capacity?
Look, I mean, I think you might find my answer a little bit surprising, but let me start off by saying something that is not obvious. You need data and statistics and information. Our statistical systems across the Arab world are terrible. They do not provide us with the information that we need. If you're going to be designing policy, it needs to be based on data and information, right? And statistics.
Right.
Otherwise, you need evidence-based policy making, right? Okay. So at the starting level, you need to instruct all our statistical agencies to start collecting the indicators that we need that are related to climate change and to fighting climate change. I think that's one part. And here I think NGOs and others can play a role. We can play a role through surveys, through going out and obtaining a lot of information on use of energy, etc., across households, businesses, and all the rest. So I think it has to be a combination of both. One other item though, technology can help us. Today, we're very clever at using all sorts of wearable watches, right, to tell us how many footsteps we've done in a day, right? I mean, and it makes us feel happy. But you can use technology really to monitor your energy use technology across a whole stream of climate-related activities, picking up that indicators. So I think what we need to do is a combination of using modern technologies for monitoring, okay, and telling us if we've introduced a certain policy, is it being effective? So if I give an incentive for people to share cars, right, or to use electric cars, are they actually using them? Those are the sort of things where we can use modern technologies to monitor and to make things happen.
Thank you very much. I will go back to Fatma. Fatma, do we have you on board? Yes. Fatma,
Yes.
what kind of linkages would you recommend be created in the UAE to provide economic incentives that go hand in hand with environmental benefits, as TJ was alluding to earlier?
Okay. Actually, the UAE financial sector is taking a big step to support the UAE vision in realizing a greener economy and sustainable development. In 2016, the UAE launched the Dubai Declaration in order to increase the financing for enhancing data and statistical to help us achieving the sustainable development goals and realizing the promising economic opportunities. The greener economy could open up as well. 32 UAE financial institutions have signed the Dubai Declaration of Sustainable Finance at that time. And they have committed to support the UAE transition to a climate resilient and greener economy. Also, Abu Dhabi Sustainable Finance Declaration was signed by 36 public and private sector entities to further advocate for sustainable finance and investment for a long-term well-being and growth of the country economy as well. Economic incentives can be supported through like public-private partnership, which can accelerate the transition and thus creating enormous environment benefit as well.
Thank you very much. So that's good to know that there is a lot that is happening on the ground in the UAE towards that direction. That's very comforting. Dr. Nasser, I'll go back to you, please. Do you think, Dr. Nasser, that a uniform global scheme should be put in place to determine how much each country needs to contribute towards climate financing, perhaps modeling it after a fair share system? If so, how do you propose going about it, if you believe that is the way forward?
Look, I mean, I think to be very direct, I think that is pie in the sky. It's simply not going to happen. If you think back on how long it took us, there's a lot of echo. There's a machine working somewhere. Ah, yeah, there's somehow a machine. If you look at how long it took us to get to the Paris Agreement, right? Something like 20 years, really, if not longer, simply to get there. I think what you need to do is to think about pricing. I think pricing is the critical bit. You need to ask for a minimum of investment in each country as a percentage of their GDP to address climate-related risk and climate-related issues. But the rest has to do with pricing. I think the main thing is, how do you price energy? How do you give disincentives for pollution? How do you price pollution? I think that is a combination of providing countries with the technology to do so, and then helping them price internally. Now, if you look at cross-border impacts, those have to be dealt with differently. But the polluter pays type principle really needs to be the basis for all. And then you need international monitoring. So I think trying to provide a global measure is going to be very difficult, in my view.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. You mentioned about all these international bodies talking about and actually giving relief on debts for the some countries within the Arab region as well. So do you think with your expertise, what way will you recommend for them to use those funds that are available to them now to create resilient infrastructural development in environmentally well, in their countries? To deal, apart from dealing with the pandemic, what about the environmental angle? How do you advise them to go about it?
Well, I mean, maybe you're going to tell me I'm dreaming, and to some extent I am dreaming.
But that's how we make the world better, by dreaming and realizing.
If we don't dream, nothing is going to happen.
Absolutely.
So the way I would see it happen is that, again, the richest countries of our region, and that means the GCC countries, have got to develop a pan-Arab program. It can go wider, of course. They can play a much more international role, but I would look for a regional program coming from the GCC countries. As I mentioned, clean energy, technology, and the like, fighting climate change should be part of foreign aid. And they should set down principles for that. A lot of the foreign aid that we give out of the GCC is not within a program. It is not systemic and with clear final objectives. Here we have the occasion to say the following. Climate change is the biggest risk facing humanity and facing our region. So let's clearly design a program to help the countries in our region fight climate change. Look at many of the countries from Sudan and others that are facing increasing water shortages, higher temperature, which means displacement of population and migration. That is a major risk for the GCC countries because it's going to mean social and political unrest in all those countries. So the GCC countries have an incentive to help stability and help them sustain their economic development and growth. So part of it has to come through foreign aid. So I would design a program for climate risk mitigation as part of foreign aid. I would also say that we should help those countries come and borrow in a sustainable finance framework from our banks and financial institutions, help our companies work with them in putting together climate resistant infrastructure. Those are the ways I think we need to move forward. And I think this needs a program at GCC level where everybody contributes. We create a fund for climate risk mitigation, for climate risk investment, for investment in clean energy. And each of the countries provides into that fund, and it is directed at addressing climate risk. I would approach it in terms of fund and then involve also the private sector. So it has to be PPP type work, because it's not the governments that are going to be providing the technology. It's going to be the private sector. So let it be PPP, encourage also private equity companies by de-risking investment in many of the countries that we want to help. That would be one way I think we should approach it. Give guarantees, de-risk investment in many of those countries.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. Again, is this wonderful, really clear direction and clear instruction actually to how to go about it. But do you think it is something that can be done by one country alone, or we need really to have a consortium of different countries, as you said, within the ones that are rich, to be able to work with the ones that need it? And is it only on our region, or this can be a global platform?
Well, I think, as usual, I think you need a champion. It has to be a consortium. There's got to be coordination, agreement on the framework, on the principles, on the indicators, what type of program, how long, and that sort of thing. But you've got already champion, I think, in the UAE. You have a Ministry of Climate Change. The first country, I think, probably in the world now that has a Ministry of Climate Change. That tells you something about what the leadership in the UAE is thinking about it. So let the UAE take leadership in terms of developing a framework and a program. Invite other countries to participate because everybody can benefit from that. As I said, the risks of climate change are not only to us, say, in the GCC countries, but also in all those countries surrounding us, which have large populations, which are facing enormous risks of climate change. So, number one, the most effective way is always to have a champion. You need somebody whose voice is out there talking about it. You've got institutions right now within the UAE, which are also international. IRENA is there. So work alongside IRENA, work alongside international bodies like the IMF, like the World Bank. I'm very encouraged, for example, by the work of the IMF. People don't think of the IMF as an institution that is concerned with climate risk and climate change, yet they are. I mean, I mentioned earlier on this rapid financing initiative to provide countries with assistance, financial assistance for those who are facing COVID-type risks. I would work alongside them. And the main reason why the IMF is so important is that they work with ministries of finance. The bottom line always is you have to convince the ministries of finance how to use scarce resources. And the IMF has a voice directly into ministries of finance. So be a champion. I would say UAE should be the champion for the GCC region. Coordinate it across the countries of the region. Work with those international bodies. Start helping the countries in our region. Yeah, they're the closest to us. They're where the risk might come from, and then expand internationally from there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser, for that very well structured response and actual practical response. There's a question from the audience. They say that with the Emirates Mars mission, aren't we losing capacity to focus on the data and statistical information gathering efforts that Dr. Nasser, you were mentioning?
Is that to me or to anybody?
It shows that it is to the panelists, but then, yeah, it's to the panelists. Look, but I would like to start with you.
Look, whenever you have deep challenges, when you always need to have vision. And I think the issue of the Mars probe should be viewed in the context of the role of the UAE in the space economy. It is very clear to me as an economist that increasingly you're going to get integrated transport systems, logistics, and all the other between land, maritime, sea, air, and then space. That's the fourth dimension in terms of transport and mobility. So it is very clear to me that the UAE and other countries need to develop a space strategy. I've even advocated that the UAE should have a space center, i.e. the ability to send rockets and satellites into space itself. We have a desert area, we're close to the equator. I would like the UAE to start thinking of sending itself spaceships into orbit and into outer space. So a space program is part of economic development for the future of the UAE. So it is not a waste. It is not a waste of resources. It is two things: giving a vision for young people to say, "Hey, think of space and the space economy and space technology as something that you want to get into," and second, starting to encourage investments in that. So I don't think it takes you away from thinking about the statistics and all the rest. At the same time, I think, and this is across the Arab world, there is a great weakness in collecting information. And the reason why we don't collect information and statistics in many of our region is that we don't have income tax. People find that a surprising maybe answer, but the way developed countries got a lot of data and information is because they imposed income tax, forcing people to report on their income and their activities. We don't have that, and as a result, we don't report on a lot of activity. So maybe over time, this will change. VAT helps us. So gradually over time, this will help, but we need to reinforce the work of our statistical agencies and make them modern, and second, make them digital. There's a lot of digital information out there which is not being used. And so we need to get our statistical agencies to start being much more active using digital technologies.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. And again, that's a very clear message on how to use the data that is available and digitize already to actual work that is needed on the ground to connect the dots between the different requirements. TJ, did you want to add anything to this point? I think maybe TJ?
Hi, Mrs. Habiba, this is Begonia. Just to let you know that Mrs. TJ just needed to leave to attend a very urgent meeting, so I'll take over for anything related to Accenture. So sorry about that, but she needed to run to this kind of a major escalation. Oh. Sorry about that.
Okay, so there's a question for Ms. TJ. To say that, can we achieve the change we aim to without technology?
Yeah, actually, this is, I mean, obviously Mrs. TJ was mentioning kind of the power of technology to achieve this change, but at the same time, going back to some of the comments of the panelists today, I mean, technology is not present everywhere in the same level as we expect. So I think that, I mean, in Accenture, we believe as well that in the power of non-technology kind of solutions must be also considered, especially in regions such as this one. Going back to the comment of Dr. Nasser, I mean, we cannot expect the same kind of implementation capacity in the UAE as it can be in other countries in the region. So I think the role of technology is clear, but at the same time, we cannot kind of neglect the power of other kind of more traditional approaches. I think that combining both of them can be the key of some of the solutions that we are facing regarding climate change.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nasser, I'm very sorry, but really having you on board and with your wonderful insights, it's just very difficult not to ask you so many questions.
Thank you.
I would like to ask really how important is the role of renewable and clean energy in addressing global health issues, such as the current pandemic that we have on hand?
Well, really two parts. One is that because of COVID, we've seen the beneficial effects of lower human activity. Human animals, unfortunately, are polluting animals. We pollute, we destroy our own habitat and environment. We're killing other species. We know all that. And it's not only because of our energy use, it's also because of our impact on their environment. So we're destroying our habitat. So the major lesson that came out of COVID for many of us is that we're now living in cleaner environments, less pollution, and it's also healthier for us. And this was one of the lessons that came out of COVID. We found out that high density, high pollution centers are also associated with a high incidence of COVID and COVID-related deaths, along with things like diabetes, obesity, and all the rest. So there is vulnerability. So we know that we should continue in that direction. And it is very clear that the answer has got to be out of renewable energy and clean technology, very clearly so. So we've had a reduction in emissions. However, if we go back to previous cases where we had big reductions in emissions, for example, after the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, it was only temporary. The emissions declined, pollution declined, but then what did governments do? In order to get economic activity going again, they've provided stimulus to polluting companies, right? To steel, to aviation, to all sorts of companies that immediately polluted the environment. The coal mines started again. So what we need to do now is to make sure that the stimulus provided by governments, and the stimulus that is being provided right now is unprecedented. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars and euros. The European Union just approved a package of 857 billion euros. What we need to make sure is that when those billions get spent, they get spent intelligently with climate risk in mind, and therefore trying to move as much of the spending towards clean energy, towards clean technology, towards digitization, towards health systems, towards cleaner cities, cleaner environments. So this is the time, if you wish, to talk about Green New Deals for everybody. So we have to be activists, is what I would say, as NGOs, as NPOs, as people active in civil and social action. We need to get our voice heard, that we should not miss this opportunity. Because remember, everybody is lining up right now to get help, right? To get subsidies because they were hurt. They were hurt by COVID. Fine, that you might want to help them, but also as you're doing that, tell them we want to do that in an intelligent, sustainable fashion. So this is the time at which we have to devote maximum resources to renewable energy. And remember, it's going to take a very, very long time. Even if we've reduced pollution maybe by some 5% over the past year. If we are to try to avoid climate temperatures rising beyond 2 degrees, we have to sustain that for at least 15 years continuously at minus 5% reduction, at least. So there's a big challenge ahead. And the best way to address the challenge is in part through technology, renewables, clean technology, but also in changing our behavior. Working from home, going back to our communities. So it's going to be a mixture between social adaptation and technology. And we need to use the technology to facilitate the social adaptation. That, I think, is going to be the two biggest challenges moving forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. You have two comments from TJ. One is she's saying that she's thanking you for talking about the women in clean, renewable energy working group that you talk about, and she would love to be involved in that. So I think you have got one new, supporter in your cause.
She has an open invitation, and as you know, Habiba, you're the most prominent member of WISE, so.
Yes, so I always talk about it, and inshallah, I'll be very happy to include her there. And I think the interactions that has been taking place with the team is very promising, and there are a lot of wonderful, high-profile women and passionate women that are already on board this working group, and we will be delighted to have TJ on board as well. The question that she's giving, TJ, is do you think that quantifying and showing the business value of transformative services to companies can help them shift to the right mindset?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think you need to tell them that it is an investment with a large payoff. Many companies are simply not aware of the large benefits of greater energy efficiency, clean technologies, renewables, etc., in their daily activities. But what TJ was pointing to a bit earlier in her intervention is important. You need to think across the whole supply chain. It's not simply putting solar panels on your roof of your factory or your business or your house. It is thinking about all your activities and supply chain, also your suppliers. Are they being energy efficient? So think about the whole supply chain. I think that's important. And for many companies, and particularly for SMEs, and remember, most of our companies are SMEs, 92%, 95% in many countries are SMEs. They simply don't have the ability to measure many of those benefits from investing in renewables and clean technology. We need to facilitate it for them. We need to give them the tools. That is the sort of thing that governments should be able to do. In some countries, your utility company can monitor how much water and electricity it is using and guide you, nudge you. I think nudging is important. So you need to provide the tools in many cases. And again, I think moving towards more digital will help you get the tools. By the way,
DEWA is doing that successfully now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if you have that, remember, utility companies reach you directly into your home, and it can make it very easy because you don't have a lot to do. They can help, they can guide you in terms of having better light bulbs, more efficient air conditioning, less use of water, all sorts of ways. So TJ is absolutely right. You need, number one, to provide the tools. You need to be able to measure. And then if you're making an investment, you need to show them what the benefits are, the return on the investment. And the returns are extremely high, we know that. But it needs to be translated into knowledge by the people who are making the investments. So some simple things. Train people in finance and accounting departments, right? Train them on how to measure the costs and benefits. Many of them simply don't know. So training of accountants, finance professionals, and all the rest is a critical bit. The other part is to have technologies which are cheap. Yeah, just like television, we don't need, you know, thousands of megapixel televisions to see each other. Look at China. They get technology available to hundreds of millions of people at very low cost. You don't need an Apple iPhone, which is going to cost you $800. You can do the same thing with a $75 machine, which does exactly the same thing, but is called something else. So think of getting technology that is available for the masses. That's really what we need. We can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. Bigona, Dr. Nasser just mentioned about the importance of engaging the supply chain and training and all this. What is Accenture doing, you know, in that? Can you share with us some examples of how you are engaging with your supply chain, whether it is with regards to climate mitigation or with dealing with COVID? Some examples, please.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. Obviously, the most of our suppliers, especially in the region, are SMEs that do not have the same capacity that global companies such as Accenture or many others can have. So the first thing that we do is for any supplier to be part of our pipeline at our pool of suppliers, they need to abide by with our commitment to reduce their carbon emissions. And we help them to do this. I mean, we tell them what we do, and we guide them in their own journey. Obviously, the carbon emissions that we have are not the same as other suppliers, but we do have experience with clients and other suppliers. So we ask them to commit to some kind of reduction, and we check with them at the end of the year if this reduction has happened. We also try to diversify as much as possible, and this is going back to the women element. We have clear commitments in terms of diversifying our supplier base, basically because we know that usually women-driven, women-led companies are much more focused on these shifts for climate change, and we have seen that it works. And we also have a supply development program in place, so that they can in turn become kind of a model for their own suppliers. So this kind of training effort pays off. We know that they become trainers of other smaller suppliers. And so that means that the benefit of this kind of awareness efforts, it can be exponential.
Thank you very much, Bigona. I have my last question to Fatma. Fatma, can you please share with us what has the UAE done with regards to greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution reduction? What measures have been taken? We know, mashallah, with COVID-19, the UAE has really set an example of the way it has dealt with it in a very professional way, in a very efficient way, and getting everybody on board, the buy-in from the different sectors of the society, from the community, from the private sector. It's really a lesson that should be taught in universities and colleges, in our institutions, and it has to be analyzed and dealt with very, very well. Can you share with us what has been done with regards to greenhouse gas emissions and with regards to air pollutions as well? And do you feel, there's a question from the audience as well, climate change goals should be only limited to national borders? Shouldn't we start thinking globally if we want to be successful? Has the UAE stepped out of the boundaries of UAE again in the way it is dealing with climate change and climate change mitigation and greenhouse gases reduction? Thank you, Fatma.
Let's go first with the first questions. Actually, most of the countries around the globe had movement restriction during the COVID-19 outbreak, and as a result, drastically altered pattern of energy demand around the world, and lower emission related to transport was there. This results in lowering of air pollution, mostly NOx, and decrease dramatically the CO2 emission as well. Here in UAE, we had similar restriction on movement during the national sterilization program, and we noticed a decrease on power demand due to the lockdown and the COVID case, and most of the industries actually stopped working, which result on actually a magnificent reported drop down in NOx and CO2 emission as well, that I presented like earlier. And in that regard, we are currently actually developing our national air quality strategy that will be guided through what happened during the COVID outbreak, taking into account that we really need to take measurement and have a much more innovative way of thinking on how to reduce emissions from the main polluters, industries, road transport, traffic, for example, even aviation sector. So this is what we are currently doing. And in regard to GHG emission, currently we are drafting the climate change law. I'm not sure if this is known or not, but we are in the phase of drafting the climate change law for UAE, and this is like the first in region. No one else have done that, and we are definitely in talk and communicating this like to our neighboring GCC countries. So we are trying to set a scene and lead this effort toward climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that's it from my side.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that that with us. With this, we would like to come to the end of our session. I would like to thank each and every one of you, but before I do that, I would like to remind all our audience and participants that we will be sharing with you feedback forms, and we really appreciate that you fill those forms to help us take note of it and build on for next events, as well as build on this platform that we are creating and working in harmony and in partnership with our sister organizations to ensure that there is a concerted effort on the national level. Dr. Nasser, thank you very much for giving us your valuable time and your valuable input and beautiful intervention, and we thank you for that deeply. And as usual,
thank you for inviting me.
Supporters.
Thank you for inviting me to be with you.
Yeah, we are very grateful for having you on board. TJ, we thank you, and Accenture for supporting and joining this platform. Is one of the wonderful organizations that is a member of EEG, and we are proud to have them on board, and we are seeing the difference that is being created by this responsible organization on the national level. Keep up the good work, Accenture, and we look forward to much more deliberation and interaction and working together. Fatima, thank you very much for your wonderful intervention and for your presentation and for joining us. We thank Ministry of Climate Change for all this wonderful work. We hope that you can share with us once you have these documents ready for public deliberation. We will be very happy to receive it and disseminate it as well to our network and to our members to give feedback before it is brought out as a law and regulations. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and inshallah we see you again in another couple of months for another panel discussion. And please join us in all these programs that we rolled out, that we have on the ground, that are ongoing. These are all very important. Everybody can join, as Dr. Nasser said, that yes, we work with the base, with the grassroots, but we work with corporations very, very closely as well. And the input from the private sector is where it makes all the difference. With the community at large, really, the purpose of it is to raise awareness and to engage them and to involve them. But where the impact is felt very clearly is from the role played by the industry and the private sector, and in all its platforms, you know, with all the sectors that we have, and of course with the government that blesses and provides the enabling environment to all our platforms, whether it is Emirates Environmental Group, Emirates Green Building Council, Clean Energy Business Council, and the others, to carry our responsibilities in an effective manner, I would say. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Fatma, thank you, Dr. Nasser and TJ, and may you all have a wonderful and fruitful day. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing us. Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, goodbye.
Hello?
Yes, Biguna, thank you very much.
Sorry, Ms. Habiba, how are you? Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Bigona. How are you?
Yeah, thank you so much again. TJ just had to leave the last half an hour, but again, it has been another super interesting. I hope that you are happy as well with how it went.
Very
so
well.
much discussions and so many things.
Discussions were very effective, and she really put the right points across. I'm sure all the audience were benefiting from this wonderful, very intellectual and very practical discussion that was going on. And I hope people will take that on board. And we will
something, but we are still online, so perhaps we can. I can end now, then you can continue offline. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we're just saying, thank you. Lovely to see you, Mrs. Habiba. We'll let you go now. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.